Welcome, every many and everyone, to this session of the seventh edition of the Plural Positivity World Conference. This session is presented by Harmonic System, covering important and sensitive topics including religion, homophobia, transphobia, sexual trauma, kink. Please remember to prioritize your self-care during this session. You're encouraged to take breaks whenever needed and honor your collective emotional well-being. If you have questions for the presenter, please share them under the Questions tab so they can be addressed during the live Q&A. Afterward, we warmly invite you to visit this presenter's booth where you'll find helpful PDFs and additional free resources. Now, without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our wonderful presenter to you all. Here is Harmonic System.
OCD, DID and Safety, and Endless Search by Headmates from the Harmonic System, a presentation about how OCD, especially with our autism, transfemininity, and religious trauma, has intersected with our blurry DID and desire to feel safe. Before we get started, there's a few trigger warnings to be aware of. Religion, especially Southern Baptist Christian, feelings of being contaminated and other OCD themes, sexuality, including sexual trauma and sexual roleplay, autmisia and psychological abuse, self-destructive and reckless behaviors, and brief use of homophobic slur reclamation in our introduction. A little bit about who we are. Our vessel is white, early 40s, raised and residing in the eastern United States. We are neurodivergent, autism in particular, with some chronic physical conditions that have a small impact on our daily life, and some chronic mental illness that has a moderate to heavy impact on our daily life. We are a mixed origin plural system of a few dozen named selves, some subsystems, additional anonymous selves, a large number of fragments, maybe other layers of headmates. We are blendy and semi-amnesiac. We are non-binary transfeminine, queer, polyamorous, sex positive, and kink positive, though some selves are degrees of asexual. And we practice nature-based spirituality while being raised semi-conservative Christian. What we will be covering today includes our history with OCD, especially with moral scrupulosity traits, things we've tried, including DBT and CPT, and how they've worked out for us, some of the improvements in our cognition and internal system relationships, and resources which we found useful for our specific situation and symptoms. Please note, this is limited to our experience and knowledge. What has worked for us may or may not work for you and. Also, this is not a treatment plan. All of the literature references and URLs will be available via the Pastebin link or QR code. So, how did we get here? We wanted to share some of our recent journey with coming to terms with OCD. We've had lifelong anxiety punctuated by frequent irrational obsessions, especially panicking about moral purity and human sexuality. This has often resulted in compulsive rejection of our sexual thoughts, compulsive moral self-auditing, and compulsive avoidance of sexual situations and art. We also struggle with some paranoia, intrusive images of violent things happening that we've never personally experienced, and at times, paralyzing fears about being destined for eternal damnation since early childhood. Because of our developing mental illness symptoms, the inside of our mind was not always a safe refuge from the scary things which sometimes happened in the external world. We also developed anxiety around any changes in our environment. As a result, we struggle with compulsive resistance to change, which makes it hard to reorganize our belongings or throw old broken things away. OCD and intrusive thoughts, especially due to religious upbringing, plus autism and sensory issues, and being queer in the 80s and 90s, making life too overwhelming was probably a big part of how our system developed. Some of our trauma partially came from our own inner struggles with moral rigidity due to a religious belief system that promised torture in the afterlife if our thoughts were too impure or if we didn't seek salvation correctly. Our caregiver's strategy of using fear to control our behavior comprised threats to our autonomy, threats of pain, and threats to our eternal soul. This was not as pervasive as our description might suggest. Our caregivers did lots of things right, but they did several things wrong, and some of those things impacted us deeply, contributing to lifelong mental pain. Being autistic, we were taught from a young age to ignore our own needs and comfort. and that our worth hinged on our usefulness to others, necessitating an intense focus on social norms, resulting in headmates who adhered to them to their own detriment, and headmates who actively rebelled against them. We had to construct endless illusions to protect our own under-nurtured sense of identity while growing up in a repressive household. As an aside, we did find some partial insight into this from Alice Miller's books, though perhaps modern attachment theory is more practical in terms of actually addressing the baggage. Annie Chen's The Attachment Theory Workbook is a decent read. Plus, it has a fun exercise in Chapter 5 about role-playing as animals to examine conflicts in relationships with anxious avoidant dynamics. Our Therian headmates found this idea very similar to natural ways they prefer to interact. A major source of early trauma was discovering that reality is a source of regular, unavoidable pain. We suffered from sensory processing issues and a predisposition towards nausea that was treated by our parents as an inconvenience they'd rather not deal with, or even something we were making up for attention. This combination of neglect and psychological abuse forced us to try to develop habits to regulate our experience of reality before we were developmentally prepared to, plus without being afforded adequate guidance, resources, or autonomy to develop healthy habits. This seems to have been a major factor in developing OCD, on top of the constant morally obsessed messaging and trauma we experienced. It's worth trying to characterize, without obsessing too much over the details, some of the ways that OCD presents itself for us. We struggle constantly with irrational anxiety, rigid thinking, intrusive thoughts, and behavioral compulsions that tend to present as very convoluted ways of doing things, especially because one of our long-term fears has been about having OCD itself, after witnessing the irrational fears and compulsive behaviors of other family members while growing up. We have a fear of having OCD, and some of our compulsive behaviors include not looking like we have OCD. This, understandably, delayed diagnosis until we are able to look below the surface and do more research. We want to take a moment to point out that many of our diagnoses have only been possible by taking steps towards self-diagnosis first. Some of our compulsive behaviors seem to exist to help us hide our dissociative amnesia, including hiding it from ourselves, such that we were only able to receive a DID diagnosis by presenting a full picture of what was going on to clinicians. And we were only able to document a full picture after pursuing the path of careful self-diagnosis. Similarly, being irrationally afraid of looking like we might have OCD caused us to have to begin recognizing our own OCD symptoms before we were able to show a complete picture of them to a clinician. We also developed intense fears of being seen as autistic after being diagnosed autistic in childhood and being mistreated extensively due to being visibly autistic. By our teenage years, we had started to form compulsive habits to hide the more obvious autistic traits we exhibited. It probably also doesn't help that our OCD is largely characterized by overwhelming fears about being a bad person, resulting in compulsive self-auditing to ensure that we're a good person. The fact that trying so hard to be a good person has sometimes resulted in more social safety has only encouraged more and more self-policing, since being rewarded with social safety is something our attachment trauma likes, especially given our struggles with oppression for being autistic and transfeminine. So our OCD presents two challenges. We have to practice recognizing what is reasonable and healthy rather than obsessing for perfection, and we have to understand what our OCD looks like for different headmates. Often, looking at what is driving the symptoms can give us some clues on how to find healthier ways of existing than futile pursuits of impossible perfection. So, I mentioned OCD manifesting differently for different headmates. Let's deconstruct that a bit. Some of us are obsessed with perfect political stances, some with perfect sexual ethics, some with having perfect relationships with others. Common themes that we find under that are peer acceptance, doing minimal harm, and sexual avoidance. Some of the underlying struggles around those themes include not feeling good enough, questioning our own morality, and managing sexual thoughts and feelings and relationships. Some trauma that may be underlying that or connected in some way is bullying, being made to feel like we're evil or cursed, and sexual trauma, including anti-sexual religious messaging. And religious messaging as trauma may need a little clarification, so I will offer that the messaging was in conjunction with threats to our eternal well-being that felt overwhelming and beyond our ability to process. But OCD and its underlying thought patterns aren't always connected to trauma. For example, we don't like anything to change in our environment. Besides the ways this can throw off our sense of familiarity and safety due to our neurodivergence, this also may relate to struggles managing our dissociative amnesia, but grew into its own unproductive fixation that results in disorganized clutter. Sometimes our manifestations of OCD started as self-management strategies, especially trying to deal with being a confused plural with amnesia, that have progressed to the point of being overgrown and frustrating to feel trapped in. So let's talk a little bit more about the intrusive thoughts. Our intrusive thoughts can run the gamut from over-worry about real but unlikely threats to absurd fixations, like being kept up at night for hours because we can't stop worrying about implausible hypotheticals like being forced to engage in cannibalism. We also experience unwanted violent images and terrifying sensations. Fighting with intrusive thoughts only serves to legitimize and strengthen them in our experience, but our morality-driven panicking makes it feel like we have to fight them vigorously, lest we become corrupted by them running rampant. The more upsetting something is, the more fears of it haunt our mind. An interesting book by Winston and Cerf called Overcoming Unwanted Intrusive Thoughts adapts CBT techniques. We found two interesting intersections worth bringing up. One is dialogue-like structure used for analyzing intrusive thoughts in the book, which resembles some internal family systems work, but uses worried voice and false comfort voice before the conversation is concluded by a wise mind voice, offering a perspective designed to encourage cognitive reframing. Wise mind perspectives show up in DBT, which we found more useful than CBT, and it's important to note that there's a pitfall to avoid for plurals here. Any headmate can have worried thoughts, or try to engage in empty self-assurance, and any headmate is also capable of practicing cognitive reframing. So the voice of wise mind could come from anyone or from a collection of headmates working together. No Gandalf headmate is required. We do have headmates who tend to get stuck in worrying, and amnesiac barriers may make it hard for them to see any other way to think. In contrast, multiple headmates listening to each other's perspectives has been a way for us to utilize our plurality to help headmates explore new, healthier perspectives. The book also discusses OCD-related worries about identity, including questions like, what if I'm actually straight, or what if I'm actually transgender, as examples of intrusive thoughts some people experience. We found this particularly interesting to reflect on, given that we dissociated away a lot of our identity struggles around being trans due to sexual bullying and strict enforcement of gender norms, especially connected to religious messaging around sin and eternal punishment. A quick aside for some more great points on this, Talia Bott's essays Understanding Transmisogyny, particularly Part 2 from her book Trans Rad Femme, illustrate how patriarchy often promotes such high stakes around social control of gender. So we wanted to mention how we looked at our own journey of discovering our transness years ago, where headmates have been able to compare notes and identify that our femininity is something with overwhelming evidence that we've often hidden from ourselves, from other sorts of worries about identity that aren't based on long-term identity aspects and aren't well supported by patterns of behaviors and genuine desires over time. This is the kind of example the book uses. A passing thought about identity through the lens of OCD can suddenly, strangely weigh on you. For us, especially with the moral scrupulosity, such identity questions include being some type of incarnate demon or monster inhabiting human form, where the only possible evidence is that we've occasionally been hurtful towards others, but there's tons of counter evidence, where we've always strove to learn to do better rather than harm anyone else again. For more on this type of topic, by the way, see our Addiction, Recovery, and Plurality presentation from 2 PPWCs back. So, one identity topic, our transness, reflects an aspect of identity hidden by dissociation. The other identity topic, as an anxiety, reflects a fear about ourselves tied to religious fears of eternal punishment and social fears of being rejected by others. One useful point made by the Winston Cerf book is identifying the amygdala's alarm response as part of a process of reinforcing unconstructive anxiety. By inviting headmates to share their experiences with each other and by seeking input from peers with similar lived experiences to ourselves, we can start to assemble a picture of what actual risks look like for us versus things that feel like risks, but which are echoes of bad messaging or trauma responses. Sometimes we've been able to work together to challenge ourselves to try things a little bit at a time. For example, an overwhelming anxiety that an interest in darker forms of erotic roleplay is an indication that there's something wrong with us. By checking the facts, namely that we have an adult body, that we're engaging in consensual roleplay with safe words, that informed headmates can choose whether they want to participate or not, that we can reflect on our experiences to understand whether they are replays of trauma or not, that human sexuality is complicated, that we aren't hurting ourselves or anyone else, and that the only real problem is our own fear and shame, we can work towards improved self-acceptance and internal non-judgmentalism in conjunction with exploring our sexuality. As Florence Ashley notes in the preface of their book, Gender Fucking, sexuality is not liberation, but perhaps we can learn about the path to liberation from it. If we approach our own cognitive patterns with compassion and mindfulness, we can start to untangle arbitrary anxiety from actual safety and practice patterns of mutual healing as we work on letting go of our internal patterns of infighting and rigidity. Careful engagement of activities that cause fear, with adequate reflection and processing time afterwards, can be part of exposure with response prevention therapy for OCD, something that we've found to be helpful, especially approaching it as a team, with headmates who handle a trigger better serving as guides and sources of compassionate feedback for headmates who don't handle a trigger as well. All right, I'm going to segue into a metaphor for a minute here, so bear with me. Earlier this year, we read an essay, which we unfortunately now cannot find, that discussed how the Continental Congress helped to organize a new system of power, increasing the chances of success for the American Revolution by offering society some replacement structure to organize around during the efforts to dismantle the existing power structure of British rule. Drawing upon the idea that building new structures must happen alongside dismantling old ones, and integrating our own values, which seek to promote both headmate autonomy and system cooperation, we have had some luck in freeing ourselves from intrusive thoughts, fixations, and compulsive behaviors by rallying around goals for what we want from our life, emphasizing flexibility and continuous learning in how we achieve those goals. To conclude the segue, it is important to note that the American Revolution favored wealthy merchants descended from European colonizers. The history of the U.S. is fraught with injustice, and the U.S. continues to engage in serious violence on the world stage. This is not an endorsement, but an examination of what it means to buy into a new system of power. It is of vital importance to not repeat historical mistakes, and we cannot ever condone inequality in any form. We have no interest in recreating any cruelty or horror from the external world within our own system. The revolution must be trauma-informed. We totally stole that sentence from a different essay that we'll give a link to, but in our defense, it is a succinct and important point. So we can identify that we have not only material needs for the body, but cognitive needs for the mind. And many of our persistent OCD symptoms are attempts to meet these cognitive needs. By working on DBT skills for managing thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, and EMDR and CPT to work through trauma, we have started giving ourselves tools for mental freedom that allow us to respond to the external world with resilience. By understanding the big picture concepts for our life goals, we are working to create our own trauma-informed revolution, where we progressively challenge ourselves in reasonable ways to open-mindedly work towards our own goals. So that's bold prose, sure. What are the practical steps we're taking? Well, a key point is identifying what feeds the OCD. Why? Well, for us, we have to differentiate between cognitive responses that are more OCD-like versus PTSD-like, because we find that we free ourselves from the OCD-like ones by taking away their power, but we manage the PTSD-like ones by making peace with them. But where is the line between PTSD and OCD after trauma? When something overwhelms you because of trauma from your past, when your cognitive landscape is altered by trauma, how do you draw a line between avoiding this is wise because it triggers my PTSD, or avoiding this is bad because that avoidance feeds my OCD? Or is that the wrong question? And we should be understanding what purpose the avoidance serves, and set targets for what's healthy in the long term, while recognizing the need to maintain stability in the short term. What if my panics relating to sexuality are simultaneously both PTSD and OCD? How do I navigate that? What we found is that trying to avoid PTSD triggers tends to lead to an increased sense of safety, whereas trying to avoid OCD triggers tends to not increase our sense of safety, but instead encourage more anxiety and cognitive rigidity. Sometimes there's overlap in the topic, and the context needs to be examined. PTSD triggers tend to be specific, like specific objects or sounds or situations, whereas OCD triggers tend to be more vague and shift around, covering many facets of an anxiety-inducing topic for us. We've had to learn that being reasonably safe is safe enough. We can be prepared to deal with unforeseen events, but we can't expend all our effort into trying to foresee and plan for every possible one. Some headmates struggle with an overwhelming need for safety, using DBT skills to help self-regulate the overwhelmed ones, then CPT skills to establish what is safe enough. Part of this involves self-trust. We've had to identify where we had gaps in trusting each other and agree on ways to address that. Sometimes involving working with headmates who tend to be a little reckless, which can erode system trust. The kinhost.org page on system trust issues has some good resources around system trust agreements. If you have a very blendy system or many anonymous headmates, well, we spoke about that at last year's PPWC, and we'll give the link for that as well. Okay, so we keep throwing around acronyms, and we probably need to talk about a couple of those a little bit more. DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, is often used for BPD, borderline personality disorder, which we may have struggled with a variant of that called quiet BPD, but that's probably a topic for another time. But a number of treatment clinics for OCD have reported success in using dialectic behavior therapy skills as adjunctive therapy, including a variety of DBT called radically open DBT. Understanding how taking healthy risks and being flexible fits into our larger life goals as a system has helped to give us some freedom from the compulsive risk avoidance and rigidity that we've struggled with. DBT has assisted with the necessary distress tolerance, as well as emotion regulation and mindfulness, including learning to approach our own intrusive thoughts in non-judgmental ways. There's a neurodivergent-friendly DBT skills workbook available inexpensively. The author, Sunny J. Wise, has posted on LinkedIn that if you absolutely cannot afford it, downloading a not quite legal free copy is acceptable. Some reviewers have remarked that the neurodivergence friendliness seems mostly autism related, but Sunny is themselves multiply neurodivergent. The book doesn't cover everything that Marsha Linehan's comprehensive but dated book covers, in particular interpersonal effectiveness, which we found useful for managing conflicts among headmates. Now the other one that may not be very well known, we didn't know about it until 6 months ago, CPT, Cognitive Processing Therapy, which has helped us identify recurring themes around trauma that often feed into our anxieties by looking for stuck points in our thinking that help drive the compulsive responses to events in our life, finding places where we have beliefs about the world formed by trauma that we may not even be fully aware of, and then challenging those beliefs and irrational thinking that interferes with managing trust and intimacy effectively, helping us reclaim our sense of personal power. What we've learned from CPT is that managing healthy trust and mistrust is important. Headmates have different sets of skills, different experiences, and different abilities to handle situation in ways that are beneficial to the system. Not trusting a headmate with a particular thing doesn't have to be a moral judgment, but can be a mere reflection of that headmate not currently having access to the skills and memories needed to navigate that thing with a high degree of success. And it's okay for this to be a learning experience we work on communally. But there's a trap here of obsessing over the learning experience. Our OCD often fixates on moral scrupulosity, perhaps due to religious upbringing, feeling the need to take a moral inventory, either 12-step style or in an unproductive, self-flagellating way, of all of us, basically every 2 to 3 days, turned out to have much more to do with OCD than system work and personal growth. We were doing this because we didn't feel safe, especially with increasingly transphobic laws in Florida in the last couple of years, making us worried we'd be scrutinized and treated unfairly. But most of that would be out of our hands, so what good was the obsession doing? And our anxiety about safety brought up an issue we dissociated into the amnesic ether of our mind, not really trusting ourselves. Particularly when we struggle to get past mistakes we made long ago, especially due to trauma reactions, including misguided protector headmates reacting too emotionally. So that obsession with a constant moral self-evaluation is connected to another problem, not having all the answers about ourselves. So what we're trying to learn is that not having all the answers about ourselves, not fully understanding our system, maybe even for the rest of our life, is fine. Because life is always changing anyway, and we're always evolving. The ways our system always seems to be having gradual shifts in structure felt like a nightmare to try to keep track of, but using bucketing-based ideas, like from last year's PPWC talk we gave, what if that's good enough? What if we don't need to keep exact track of things in our system? What if trying too hard to keep track of it constrains our ability to evolve and adapt? We also sometimes try to compulsively inventory our trauma and requirements to call ourselves healed. Being able to look past the details and identify themes to work on with flexible, big picture objectives for growth has helped. We have to remember that we have a lot to do. We'll process our experiences when we're ready and no sooner. I mean, sometimes you gotta just be gay and do crime for now, then come back to filling in the remaining holes in your self-narrative later, right? We have to get out there and live our life, especially in defiance of a world that seeks to silence and erase those who are different. So, rather than constantly evaluating a detailed moral balance sheet, it's been more useful to understand the general narrative of our life and providing values-based context for the mistakes we've made. Did we hurt someone else because we were misinformed, coerced into harmful behavior, acting out while being abused, or engaging in attempts at self-defense which were misguided? Rather than continually grade ourselves, we can establish values for how to live our life and leave a positive mark on the world, and center those values, but allow room to make small mistakes and learn from them. And we can choose to include the ability to learn from mistakes as a value. Flexibility to make mistakes in a constructive way takes us back to trust. It's possible to incorporate both trust and mistrust internally. We can move forward in our life knowing that our intuitions will disagree, and this may lead to mistakes, but also that we have a pretty good capacity to avoid many mistakes and mitigate the fallout from the ones we do make. For example, a couple of years ago, a teenage headmate wanted to take the wheel when driving. So we let her drive some, and then someone pulled out right in front of us. And a nearby adult headmate, who is a very experienced driver, was able to quickly grab front and swerve to avoid a collision. This was probably possible because we had been trying to develop healthy internal relationships. We have not always moved forward in terms of healthy system dynamics, but we try to keep coming back to that especially when we notice headmate conflicts starting to happen more often. What CPT also has taught us is that we need to examine where we give power and take power in both positive and negative ways. We can redirect ourselves from reactiveness and fawning, especially towards each other internally, toward helping empower each other's autonomy by sharing skills and knowledge, changing our ways of giving power internally from negative to positive. We can redirect ourselves from negative ways of taking power, like internal provocation and boundary testing behaviors, towards a positive approach of mutual agreement on what constitutes fair boundaries by encouraging collaboration. When headmates have buy-in on the boundaries and goals of the system, this can encourage honesty and less self-destruction for us. Many of our difficult headmates see themselves as trying to solve a problem with the limited perspectives and skills they have. Acknowledging that they have legitimate needs and problems, and that their approaches could be sensible attempts based on their own understanding of the world, and then non-coercively offering new ways of approaching those needs and problems, is more likely to result in collaboration for us. We find teamwork is strongest when everyone is given the opportunity to contribute and have emotional buy-in. Not inviting everyone to the table just results in fighting and sabotage that tends to amplify compulsive behaviors. This may or may not be relevant for other plurals with OCD, but for us, the cognitive rigidity often associated with our OCD symptoms is something we have had some luck addressing by bringing both trauma processing and self-regulation skills into a collaborative setting. Sometimes deciding which of our internal power struggles to tackle as a system involves assessing how much is on our plate and then choosing some priorities. An interpersonal effectiveness skill we learned in a DBT skills group called the dime game, where a series of 10 questions, each worth 10 cents, are used to decide how important a challenging interpersonal interaction might be, has been at least partially useful in deciding whether we want to tackle something which could cause conflict between headmates, and we will give a link to where you can try that out online. We can use mindfulness techniques to try to learn from our behavioral patterns without falling into OCD mentality around analyzing them. Maintaining a sense of curiosity and non-judgmentalism helps us examine our own behaviors without engaging in as much emotional self-harm as we used to. So back to one of our core issues. We can have a complicated sex life with some residual trauma and occasional bizarre sexual thoughts, because we have tons of evidence that we can and do engage in sexuality in healthy ways, despite our worry that we're some sort of problematic freak due to some thoughts we've experienced. We may even be more conscientious in our sexual relationships than some people are due to studying some feminism, so we don't need to obsess as much as we do. Though maintaining a strong awareness of the ways that patriarchy shapes interpersonal interactions all across society is a desirable thing to keep. At times, our study of feminism may have been partially driven by anxiety, but the insights and perspectives have been truly beneficial. So, headmates having differing comfort levels around wild sexual fantasy and heavy kink isn't something to worry about. Identifying that we have unreasonable internal fears about our mind becoming sexually contaminated allows us to apply therapeutic techniques for OCD, targeting some of the puritanical messaging we grew up with, practicing removing its cognitive power over us. Due to the extensive messaging about morality we received growing up, we have formed a lot of stuck points that have formed the basis of moral obsessions. We have often taken a combination of scattered facts and numerous assumptions to conclude that we need to regulate our own feelings in very rigid ways. We must always maintain the perfect amount of empathy for each party in every situation. We must always maintain the perfect amount of outrage at some of the horrors of the world, never faltering for a second. We have also struggled with how much life feels worth living, trying to separate the facts of ways we have been hurt from the assumptions we have about the likelihood of being hurt again. Challenging ourselves to separate facts from assumptions and look for new frameworks of understanding facts has been useful, though frustrating. We at one point held a lighter to a corner of a CPT worksheet for challenging beliefs that reinforce stuck points, before thinking better of it and extinguishing the burning paper. We can experience irrational and overwhelming fear when questioning some of the trauma-inspired beliefs that fuel our OCD. Navigating that has required practice and patience, and we have had some success by practicing distress tolerance by starting with smaller sources of distress that are lower stakes or that feel like they pose less of an immediate threat. It's important to focus for us on working together as a system to decide what our priorities are, because we have multiple headmates who will compulsively pursue certain actions past the point of usefulness. Even being a blurry system, a sea of voices approach, where system meetings involve many anonymous contributions, is still very viable for finding a decent consensus. We can announce, "If this matters to you, please speak up, for we are too soupy and numerous to have everyone do individual ballots," as well as, "If you miss the opportunity to speak up, leave a note for the future," with a plan to revisit priorities as needed. This entails separating some priorities into long-term and short-term, because we may need to adjust short-term priorities pretty regularly as people come and go from semi-dormancy. But we don't want to lose critical long-term priorities in that swirling flux. So that brings me to the idea of finding our center, finding what helps each of us excel at the things that we're good at, and encouraging productive behaviors and rational thinking rather than compulsion and obsession. Then building a plan around that we all feel pretty comfortable with. That helps us establish the long-term priorities. It's better if the plan is not too specific, because then we can start thinking obsessively about it, but rather is a flexible strategy that centers our shared values. So, what are our shared values? It can be hard to identify when we are arguing internally because the focus goes on the things we disagree with. But when we notice other human beings acting in ways which make us all feel disgusted, we know we have a shared value against the behavior which disgusts us. Even our headmates who struggle with disturbing thoughts and feelings find that the reason they struggle is because they know those intrusive thoughts disturb them, and their anxiety, caused by such thoughts and feelings, reveals that they too share those values, even if the intrusive thoughts run counter to those values, morally or otherwise. And for us, those intrusive thoughts being so difficult to process is partly because of the moral scrupulosity aspect or fixation of our OCD, to which we have been applying DBT techniques. Something helpful for us has been accepting compromise when setting priorities and directions. It often feels like we are compromising more than we really are, but that is based on how obsessive our fears can be. Fears of not completing or doing what we feel we need to complete or do. As long as our core values are met, we are on the right track. We can always adjust later if we need to. We have to focus on what we actually have the capacity to work on right now. And one of the things we have to work on is practicing disengaging from the overwhelming fears about all the things we can't control and can't fix. Those fears are like mountains that we keep trying to climb, ignoring the fertile valleys nearby where we could be planting seeds. Our resilience grows by learning to redirect our energy towards what we actually have the capacity to address. This requires regular practice, especially since we seem to intuitively gravitate towards psychological mountain climbing and other Sisyphean endeavors. Redirecting each other's focus toward things where we can actually make measurable progress is not a trivial task, but it is a worthwhile one. So that brings us to our final thought, that there is safety in understanding where it's okay to make small mistakes. There is value in giving each other the autonomy to make small mistakes and learn from them. Approaching each other with kindness and empathy helps to ensure we can keep working together on growing resiliently. So that's it. Thank yous for taking time for our presentation. We realized when we were recording from our notes that we wanted to phrase a whole bunch of things differently, and we started making changes, and then we decided maybe that we were starting to obsess over it and needed to only make a few important changes and move on. So we hope it was okay. I'm sure there's a lot of things that could be better. Please feel free to share feedback. We can be reached via email, harmonicsis@yahoo.com. We would really love to hear from other systems who experience OCD, especially moral scrupulosity-related issues, and or plurals who have had success with DBT and CPT techniques. Once again, thank you, every many, and please take excellent care of yourselves.